Why do we believe in conservatism?
Wishful thinking. Next. What's up, guys? Today we got something kind of nutty to deal with. Not like these. No, what we're dealing with today is Abby Shapiro attempting to tell us why being conservative is so important. But as you all likely know, before we can get into that, we have to get into the fan art section. First of all, we have a Kitsune Rule 63 Suris by Kian Vampiri. And then we have another Suris portrait by Calviny. Finally, with the Uwu Neko Rule 63 Suris stamp of approval by Bumblin' As always, thank you all for your fan art submissions, and let's get right into this video, which does not get the Uwu Rule 63 Neko Suris stamp of approval.
Why do we stand up for the American way? Why do we espouse traditional values, even while those around us fight to dispute the most fundamental truths?
Do you even know how to define truth?
Why? Because being conservative matters.
Oh, you're gonna do that thing where, like, there's an a priori, and the a priori is that conservatism equals truth, and therefore you uphold the truth, and then everything on the other side is not conservatism and is therefore, like, radical and also not truth. Maybe the history of conservatism would be a very important thing for you to learn, Abby. You see, conservative thought began as a method of trying to argue that the divine right of kings, of monarchs, was a thing that should be maintained. Because if you were essentially a middle-class noble, you had the ability to keep your power so long as the monarch had their power. As long as they had their power, then your place in the hierarchy would be maintained. There's this idea amongst some lefty communities that conservatives believe that they're just temporarily displaced billionaires. Eventually, they'll get to the top, the tippy-toe top, but that's not always the case. There are people that believe that they are just here to make an honest living. But if their wages get taken away by lower class people, that's bad. So they have to funnel power into the higher class people who are going to protect them from the lower class. It's the same thinking that were used to justify monarchies in the past. The divine right of kings is there, and as long as they had their ability to maintain power, then you'd maintain yours. Not necessarily that you want to gain more power. That's a huge misconception that people on the left seem to have. The idea is not that they want to gain more, and therefore must claw their way further and further to the top because one day they'll be billionaires too. The idea is to establish that it's okay for the billionaires to be there, or the monarchs to be there, and therefore your place in the hierarchy, however low, can be maintained. I actually planned on doing a video about this, going into the history of conservative thought in the different areas of the world where it actually began in the form that we understand it now. But the thing is that video has already been made by a much better channel than me. I'm going to be providing a link in the description below to a video from Innuendo Studios that goes into this way better than I could, so I just ended up scrapping the entire project. But what you probably should understand is there's a difference between the term conservative, meaning I'm going to uphold tradition, and conservative, the political ideology, which is much more insidious. What Abby and channels like her generally tend to do is they try to argue that they're in favor of this traditional value system, this thing over here that's not actually being threatened, but they argue that it is because victim mentality is very important to them. But in reality, the political ideology of conservatism ends up being spoken for as well. So it's not just conservative, I just like family values and tradition, which is the thing you can uphold just by having a traditional family. You end up having the other baggage that comes with conservatism that doesn't need to be over here. You can be a full-blown leftist and have a traditional nuclear family with all the trappings that the conservative would think are perfectly acceptable. In fact, actually, one of the examples of this little dichotomy is groups of conservatives that argue for this position over here, getting onto people like Hunter Avallone, who's moved away from conservatism and moved more into a center position politically. They're mad that he doesn't hold this position over here, the political ideology of conservatism, even though these are the people who generally argue in favor of conservatism, the traditional family values, the aesthetics, all of that fun stuff. They argue for this, and Hunter has this. He's got 2 kids, he's got a wife, he's basically living out their traditional nuclear family model, but that's the thing. It's never about this. This over here is the scapegoat. This over here is what's actually being delivered.
Being conservative today is not an easy path. You will be faced with every kind of hatred.
What kind of hatred are you going to get? Well, let's go ahead and hear out the video, because she might actually extrapolate on that point.
From minor insults of your intelligence to the doxing of your private information.
That has nothing to do with being conservative. That happens to lefties too. I've had people try to dox me. I've had people literally put my face on effigies and fire a gun at it multiple times. Trust me, that's not a conservative issue. That's just an internet issue.
To rioting and violence.
Rioting? That you are subjected to riot. You, as a conservative, are subjected to rioting. No. Pretty certain that when riots happen, they affect everyone. Conservatives, leftists, liberals, centrists, anybody in the area is affected by the rioting. I feel like you're trying really hard to be a victim. Like really hard.
You will be labeled a million different things that have nothing to do with your true beliefs.
So maybe what would help here, Abby, is if you actually extrapolated on your beliefs. In other episodes I've done on you, I've noticed that you tend to be very vague and wishy-washy with the actual beliefs that you hold. You never actually get into specifics unless it's something like abortion. You'll talk at length about abortion, but then again, getting into specifics about that is pretty easy. So my question is, in this video, are you going to be specific with me about what your beliefs are? Because if we are to accept that you are persecuted for your beliefs, it may be a good idea for us to figure out what beliefs you're holding. As an example, and these are not the beliefs that Abby Shapiro holds, at least I hope not, but if you believe that black people, for instance, are genetically inferior to white people, and then you cry persecution, you deserved it. Every single bit of persecution you get for that is going to be something that is brought on directly by your bigoted belief. And while I might argue that there's a certain level that people should not cross when it comes to dealing with you, I can't argue that they're not coming from the right place.
You will be afraid of being an outcast in a culture that doesn't want to hear about morality or truth.
Those are also very vague words. What kind of morality? Are we talking about anti-realism? Because, like, that'd be neat. Are we talking about objectivism, subjectivism? Are we talking about error theory? What kind of morality are we talking about? Are we talking about virtue ethics? Are we talking about virtue ethics? Because that's a neat conversation. What kind of morality are we talking about? And moreover, I don't think you want to have a conversation about truth. It's not that I don't doubt that you might be incredibly knowledgeable on the topic, but even using that word was a bit of a trap. Truth is a conversation, if you are in philosophy circles, that lasts for hours and hours and hours. And it is not that I think that Abby does not have the ability to engage in that conversation. It's that I don't think that she's going to engage in that conversation in her 2-minute-long YouTube video.
But America needs conservatives. America needs conservatives to keep alive what this country stands for, what this country was built on, and the principles that make this country great.
Those might be some really awkward words when you consider the fact that this country was built on principles like slavery and keeping slaves. In fact, actually, the American Revolution is probably a thing you shouldn't be talking about if you're going to have an issue with riots, just in general. I'm going to be honest, the idea that we should be upholding what this country was built on is wonderful in principle, but when you put it into practice, everybody's interpretation on that is going to be a little bit different. So my question to you is, what particular principles should we be upholding? What particular values should we be upholding? Or are we just going to continue with the vague labels?
Even as the mob and the elites will try to tell you that America has no right to exist at all.
The mob and the elites. Abby, your brother is worth $25 million. You're in bed with the elites. That wasn't me trying to say that she's in bed with her brother. I'm close enough to Alabama to understand that type of joke hits a little close to home for some people.
America needs conservatives to fight for freedom, not as defined by shallow and sinister modern theories, but as developed by our heritage.
That sounded like a nod to postmodernism. I'm not going to strawman and pretend that that's what she meant, because I don't honestly know. But when you argue in favor of our heritage, the heritage of America are things like the Red Scare, things like the Vietnam War, things like postponing our entry into World War II, because of reasons that Godless Cranium goes into on his channel very well in the Cycles of Fascism series that we may or may not be continuing. We have a heritage of slavery. We have a heritage of violent war and revolution. Oh, that's another awkward subject for you, isn't it? You're against violent. Okay, anyway. So my question is, what is it about our heritage that invariably makes it better to strive for than a modern theory on morality? And the reason I ask that question isn't because I de facto believe that the modern theories on morality are better. It could be the case that I do, could be the case that I don't, but that doesn't matter for the example. The reason I ask is because when you argue that we have to strive for our heritage instead of something modern, and you do it just based on that, you don't give me any examples, then I have to accuse you of engaging in the appeal to antiquity fallacy. You are trying to argue that we should strive for the things that were good in the past because they were in the past, and in the past that means they're good. But there's so much baggage there. Ignoring the fact that it's a fallacy in general, there's so much baggage in our heritage. Exactly what should we be striving for from our heritage? That would be my question, and I really don't feel like you're going to answer it.
America needs conservatives to keep the record straight on our history, to stop those who would rewrite it for their own benefit.
Okay, that one sounds like that's a jab at critical race theory, which is not a rewriting of history. The critical race theory, again, this is me pretending that this is what she's actually talking about. I believe that's what that's a nod to. If you're going to argue that, critical race theory is not about rewriting history, it's about looking at history from a different perspective. So generally speaking, with history, there's a saying, and that is, to the victor goes the history. So to the victor of wars, they get to write the history. They get to write the narrative. They get to push whatever narrative is, no matter how truthful it is. This is a thing that happens for victors of any wars. So what critical race theory does is it looks at history from the perspective of people of color, of slaves, of anybody who could have been oppressed, instead of from the narrative perspective of the victors. That's not rewriting history. That is literally just engaging in a different perspective. Now, there are criticisms that can be labeled at critical race theory, but I don't think rewriting is one of them that we can really engage in. Revisionism is not one that we can argue for. Now, if you would like a perspective on history that is in fact revisionism, look at the way that history is taught currently in public schools. Look at things like how we treat characters like Christopher Columbus, how we treat characters like Abe Lincoln, how we treat things like the Civil War when we argue that the Civil War was for states' rights, but we don't talk about what the states' rights we were actually fighting for were. When we talk about Honest Abe, who never told a lie, when we talk about the mythology of George Washington and ignore any of the terrible things that he actually did, like keeping slaves on his plantation in Pennsylvania and circumventing the law that he helped set up in Pennsylvania that said that his slaves would have to be freed if he kept them for 6 months. He would literally throw them to another state after 5 months so that their timer would reset and he could bring them back. We don't talk about those things. We already revised that by whitewashing our history. That's a thing we've already done. So when you argue in favor of a position of historical accuracy, like you're attempting to do, and you try to argue against revisionism, maybe you shouldn't stand in a glass house that has already engaged in tons of historical revisionism. And moreover, I don't know whether or not Abby Shapiro directly supports Donald Trump, but the idea of patriotic education has been brought up by Trump, which is historical revisionism. So it's very weird to me when I watch an Abby Shapiro video, and aside from the fact that she's giving a shit ton of platitudes with no actual details, she's also giving us this weird argument while sitting in the middle of a glass house. Holy shit, I just realized the structure of this video is going to be a lot more loose than normal. There's generally more cuts in here, but I'm just kind of letting them go this time. Just let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Generally, I edit a little more heavy than this.
America needs conservatives to fight for everyone's right to free speech, because there is no truth when one party can declare its propaganda as fact.
The self-awareness of that statement just doesn't exist. There is a conversation to be had about free speech, in that there should be a type of speech that we do deem as harmful enough to not allow on certain platforms, or not allow into certain forums. And the reason for that is that when you have free speech absolutism, anybody can say anything, but you create an environment where people who are in minorities, or people who are oppressed in some way, like legitimately oppressed, not Abby Shapiro oppressed, these people generally don't have the ability to speak in many areas. They can say words, yes, but the ramifications of a person of color speaking in a forum that is filled with, say, white supremacists who are open and vocal about it, the ramifications to them are massive. Whereas having a very strict set of rules on what is and isn't allowed as far as like hate speech, harassment, threats, etc., having laws and rules and regulations about that, especially in various forums, allows those minority opinions to speak in a safer place. They don't have the ability to enter certain places and speak more freely when more damaging speech is not accounted for and controlled. What is actually aided in a conversation when you come in and start talking about eugenics? What benefit is there in the conversation when you start talking about the Jewish question? What is gained in the marketplace of ideas when ideas that we understand and have tested thousands of times are incredibly harmful to minority groups and to people who otherwise have done no wrong? What is gained in the marketplace of ideas when those ideas are allowed to hone their rhetoric until they can convince the masses? The problem with the free speech model, when you keep it as absolute, is you live in a fantasy world that the marketplace of ideas is going to sort out the good ideas into the bad. But the problem is that good ideas and bad ideas don't just hinge on the efficacy of the fundamentals they stand for. Good ideas and bad ideas also stand alongside the rhetoric used to deliver them. Bad ideas, things like the Jewish question, things like race realism, things like, outright racism and misogyny. Those bad ideas can be packed behind good rhetoric, and then somebody who is well-intentioned, who could be arguing for an actual functional version of affirmative action that has a cap on it so that we can get people who are otherwise segregated and otherwise oppressed into a functional area of society. People on this side really might need this idea to be pushed for them so that they have a better shot going forward. They don't have things like generational wealth to stand behind yet. But if the rhetorician who's arguing for these things isn't as strong as the JQer over here, there's where the idea behind the marketplace of ideas starts to fall flat. The efficacy of the ideas is not the only thing that's being pushed. It's also rhetoric. This is one of the reasons why it's so important to figure out who you're actually going to allow to platform on a channel. Because when you are platforming people on your channel, it doesn't matter if you're the most right or smartest person in the entire world. If they have better rhetoric than you, then you're toast. And that's just how things have operated in debate forums for years. Debate, the marketplace of ideas, all of it, it is 50% ideas and 50% theater. It might be skewed more towards theater, actually. So when you try to sit here and argue for free speech, free speech, free speech, you have to kind of understand what free speech means. There's functional free speech, and then there's legal free speech. If you want legal free speech, sometimes you end up limiting functional free speech. And sometimes functional free speech requires certain limitations on legal free speech. I probably should have just made free speech an entire video, but now it's a segment on an Abby Shapiro video. How do you feel?
America needs conservatives to return us to the idea of family so that this nation's children have the privilege of a mother and father within the home.
And there is the euphemism trying to argue against both poly people and anybody who happens to be LGBTQIA+. While Abby may be engaging in tons of platitudes that don't really have any meaning without context behind them, this is one that you can definitely see, and on the surface, which is the purpose of a euphemism in general, on the surface, it looks perfectly fine, perfectly reasonable. Yes, we want to save the American family. That's a wonderful thing to fight for. But here's the thing. The American family isn't under attack. The nuclear family model is a thing that people can engage in right now without any issues whatsoever. Nobody's going to question you for having a nuclear family. They're going to question you for having a polyamorous family. They're going to question you for having a gay family. They're going to question you for having a family that includes a trans person. These are things that are actually questioned, actually fought against. The nuclear family model? The only thing that most people against the nuclear family model want to do is destroy the idea that that's the only valid family model around. Because all of the data that supports the nuclear family model being the most best stable family model is also being harvested from people who believe, as an a priori, that the nuclear family model is better. This means that generally, families, like extended families, don't support non-nuclear families as often as nuclear families receive support from their extended families, which in turn makes them more or less stable depending on how those families operate. So when somebody tries to argue that we need to save the nuclear family, and even when they start arguing and bringing in facts and data, you have to point out the context in which that data was harvested. And especially when someone like Abby is arguing where they're not going to bring the data, they're just going to bring the rhetoric, point out that the rhetoric is in fact being homophobic. I understand you want to fight for the nuclear family, but that's not actually being attacked. When you try to argue that your family type is the extra most best perfect one, you're diminishing the value of other functional family models.
America needs conservatives to preach the American dream as a beacon of hope, available to all who would reach for it.
If reaching for the American dream was all that was required to get it, then homelessness would not exist in America. Poverty would not exist in America. You're literally selling a fantasy. Now, it's a fantasy that some people can achieve. Hard work can do amazing things. Hard work can get you much further in life. But the fantasy is that hard work is all it takes.
Conservatism is vital to America, building on our past, repairing our present, and ensuring our future.
Platitude, platitude, platitude. Are you trying to do an election campaign?
Being conservative matters. And in the absence of a real-life Superman, we are the warriors of truth, justice, and the American way. Thank you so much for watching today's video.
If I pour this directly into my eyes, will it erase the fact that I saw this video? Probably not, but we're gonna do it anyway. Fuck, that burns! It didn't solve anything! None of that solved anything! If you enjoyed the episode, go do YouTube stuff. I'm gonna go put some milk in my eyes. Patrons, just insert end of... Fuck!